Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to episode 89 of the Cloudcast. Actually, this is take 2 of episode 89 of the Cloudcast. We recorded this a couple of weeks ago, and unfortunately, due to a complete screw-up on our end, we botched the audio on this, had a great conversation. Look forward to a very, very good conversation this time as well. Before we get started, want to introduce our guest. The last couple of weeks we've been talking about networking. I want to introduce our guest again tonight. He is J.R. Rivers, who is CEO/engineer, which is a very kind of cool and unique title these days, of Cumulus Networks. J.R., welcome to the show, or welcome back again. Thanks again for doing this for us.
Thanks, Brian. Hello, everyone.
So, before we jump into Cumulus a little bit, your background is sort of unique. You're one of the very few people I think that can realistically say, I've done some very, very serious engineering. I've worked for massively large-scale companies, web-scale companies. You've been and worked in some of the sort of areas that nobody really knows about, and now you're back on the technology side developing stuff. Give folks a little bit of background of what your last, even just 4 or 5 years have looked like, because it's pretty broad and it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, well, I spent about 12 years at Cisco from 93 to 2005 and did a bunch of the pizza box Ethernet switches and kind of grew up with that whole world of bridging and routing and the whole evolution there. And then I was lucky enough to work for a little while at Google as they were starting their exercise into building their own networking equipment. And then after that, I got tapped to be the VP of System Architecture for Nuova Systems, and we built the unified computing system for Cisco, along with the Nexus 5000 and 2000 products. And then the last few years have all been Cumulus Networks. So it's been pretty crazy stuff. A lot of networking, a bunch of compute, a lot of automation and system integration. So for a number of people, if they weren't familiar with what you had done previously, you were highlighted last year, a little bit earlier last year, by Wired Magazine, talking about a little bit what you said. Google building their own switches, some of the web scale guys doing it, but also talking about kind of this whole world of OEM and ODM. Where does Cumulus fit into that space in terms of is it a hardware company? Is it a software company? Where are you guys? What are you doing these days, and where are you providing value? I've been working with some of the silicon providers in the networking industry for a really, really long time. People like Broadcom and to some degree Intel as well. And what I was able to recognize is that the silicon that they're developing is on par with that anybody else is building at a proprietary company, or I should say proprietary company, but at a larger company. And more importantly, is it will only get better and better as time goes on. Just like x86, it's a great big machine that's just never going to stop because these guys are investing in the physics required to make it happen. As I watched that occur, I realized that like you said, some of the big web scale companies are figuring out how to increase their networking capacity by leveraging that silicon base, and then the manufacturing capabilities of some of the hardware suppliers, and then putting their own software, or contracting with people like us to do the software, but everybody else doesn't get to play in that game. And so Cumulus was founded to be able to get that kind of network capacity into everybody's hands.
Okay, so. You guys we're recording this a little bit early. You guys have been sort of stealth, or at least below the radar. Next couple of days, you're making a fairly large announcement. What's the big announcement? Where are you telling the world?
Well, we're launching the company, which is kind of to some degree neither here nor there, but at least we'll have a website that's slightly interesting from here on out. But more importantly, we're announcing our product, which is Cumulus Linux, as well as a set of hardware partners and distributors and VARs, so that people can get access to a full solution, a full networking solution, from hardware, a broad set of hardware suppliers, as well as our software supply base.
Okay. So a Linux distribution, but a Linux distribution specifically for networking, correct?
Yeah, exactly. As Nolan and I were starting up Cumulus, we looked at the possibilities around networking software, and we recognized that while many companies are out building their own proprietary operating systems in this space, Linux itself has a pretty full-featured set of capabilities, and more importantly, all the relevant development around system management and network virtualization and all the up-and-coming technologies are being implemented first in software on Linux, and then eventually people migrate them into their proprietary operating systems. And we realized that that doesn't really serve the customers that well, because they're happy with Linux. So we decided to take Linux and hardware accelerate it and make that available to customers.
Okay, so a couple of sort of Linux specific questions are about that. So, in the past there's been networking devices that ran Linux. They tended to be appliances, so there was firewalls or IP, sort of edge devices, or not core packet moving devices. What's different now? I mean, what have you guys done that's sort of unique in terms of helping people get over the fact that Linux wasn't necessarily designed to be a network operating system in terms of performance or latency?
Yeah, well, it ends up that the networking silicon, again, from people like Broadcom and Intel, does all the heavy lifting, not only in the products that we work on, but pretty much all of the enterprise, layer 2, layer 3 networking products. They're all kind of hardware accelerated. And so what we've done is taken the Linux kernel data structures and we merge them down into the hardware and vice versa.
Okay.
So if something happens in the hardware side, it needs to move up to the kernel, we make the kernel aware of it. And so it's not so much that you have to worry about the CPU-bound packet performance of Linux getting in the way of your ability to move packets, because that's all done in hardware anyways.
Okay. So sort of similar to what Intel did with what they called Intel VT, which helped accelerate virtualization on servers. Similar concept?
Actually, that's a great example. It's very, very similar to that. The control plane in the case of networking, or the management CPU, will set up the hardware to do what it needs it to do, and then after that, the hardware just takes off and takes care of the mundane daily tasks.
Okay, gotcha.
It ends up that all the network operating systems that exist do this anyways. Arista EOS and Cisco NXOS have Linux underpinnings. Junos has a BSD underpinning, but then they tend to do a lot of the heavy lifting in user space, which is actually even slower than doing it in the Linux kernel.
Okay, yeah, that was the good news for my next question. Is what's really the difference between what you guys are doing, which I think is sort of natively exposing Linux, versus other companies who sort of wrap something around Linux, and is it mostly about where it runs, or are there other really distinct differences between what you guys are doing and like some of the others that you just mentioned?
I think part of it's where it runs, and the other part is what it and how that translates to a customer. With what we're doing, the functionality is extremely transparent, because you can go look at the source if you really want to see how something is supposed to behave. Okay. We just mimic, reflect that behavior on the hardware side of things. The other part is kind of tying back to the management and provisioning systems, in that those are all built to deploy, or at least the ones that people are using these days are built to deploy Linux-based servers at high scale. And so, tools like Chef or Puppet or Nagios or Ansible, all of those things work directly on top of this platform without modification. So it allows us to innovate, and allows our customers even to innovate on their own without us getting in the way.
Okay. It keeps you guys out of the business of having to be bogged down with management systems and management platforms and all those types of things.
Yeah, I mean, we spend a lot of time supporting them and making sure that they work as expected for customers, but we don't have to tell them how to manage the platform. They get to choose that for themselves.
Okay. So you mentioned a second ago, people can go look at the source. Is this something that, as you go to market, I'm not sure if this has all been finalized, but as you go to market, there'll be an open source version of this and then a commercial version, or what's the thinking around how you distribute it?
Yeah, so the software itself is distributed as a Linux distribution.
Okay.
Some networking buyers like to buy what they call a golden image, and so we'll offer it in that form as well. But the main thinking is much like a Linux distribution, like Red Hat or Ubuntu or Debian. In fact, we're based off Debian as a foundation.
Okay.
And so for anything that is open source, like the kernel or the routing protocols or the management plane, people have the access to source if they really want to dig in there and see what's going on. And if people really feel adventurous, they can decide to run the modified source. They can patch it or add their own routing protocols outside of that.
Okay, so this isn't you guys reinventing BGP. This isn't you reinventing sort of the layer 2 and layer 3 protocols. This is really you focusing on optimizing hardware, optimizing the OS within that from a Linux perspective, and making it much more deployable and deployable much more like servers, right?
Exactly. And then also another big angle is, or not angle, but a characteristic is that qualification and enhancement of all of those pieces. So you mentioned BGP. We're not writing it from scratch. In fact, we use Quagga and Bird depending on which customer is interested in which characteristic. And we fix bugs and add performance improvements and all of the things that you would expect in those communities. And then we push our modifications upstream and make them available to anybody that wants to use them.
Okay. So you talked a little bit about you're trying to make this available for the mainstream. You talked about partners and distributors. If I was a large enterprise today, so we're not maybe talking about the next Facebook or something, but I'm a large bank, I'm a large insurance company. What's my interaction look like? I mean, people are used to networking coming like in the Apple model where it's hardware and software. What's the new interaction look like? Who would they buy hardware from, or how does that work?
Well, it looks a lot like they buy their servers, and actually, interestingly enough, to some degree, how they buy their networking. If you're a bank, for instance, you might use CDW as your VAR, and to buy a server, and so you'll call CDW and order a Dell server, and you'll order it with a certain set of operating systems on it, and it will come to you all pre-configured and set up, and it'll come through that one supplier. If you buy a Dell server and it comes with Red Hat pre-installed by Dell, then you go to Red Hat and pick up that software license to use RHEL on the platform.
Okay.
And in our case, it comes in a very similar way. They buy the hardware from someone like CDW is not one of our distributors, but they're on the list of people we're working with, and they would buy that hardware from one of the distributors or a VAR. And then they would come to us to get a license to run Cumulus Linux on it.
Okay. And for the network hardware, are they coming from names that anybody would have heard of, or are these mostly sort of what are considered to be ODMs, in that terminology?
I think it's for the mainstream enterprise buyer, I'd say they're mostly considered to be ODMs.
Okay.
With that said, people like Acton and Agama or Quanta, Celestica, but these suppliers have been manufacturing for the largest networking companies for decades. Okay. And so they have a pretty long-standing heritage of deployment and high quality systems.
Gotcha. So it's really more of a shifting of the supply chain, if you will, than new companies, right? They're just moving from being one step away from the customer to one step closer to the customer.
Exactly. It's kind of eliminating a middleman.
Okay. Now, as you guys are talking to potential customers or people in this, what's the new operations model look like? I mean, what's the skill? Is the skill set going to become kind of move from your traditional, CCIE network-centric skills to much more of a sysadmin type of skills, or what's a Linux network operator's life look like or skills look like?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that in data centers all over the place, operational efficiency is starting to become really important. The scale of what's being deployed is such that you can't get by with manually configuring each piece.
Okay.
And if you look at the server side, I mean, if you kind of roll back a few years on networking, you'd see a world where you could buy maybe a couple Cisco Catalyst 6500s, put them in the middle of your network, and do everything from there, and just configure those few things manually. But then you'd have a couple thousand servers underneath, and the server admins had to become really efficient. So they built out a bunch of tools to allow them to do that. Again, the puppets, the chefs, Ansible's coming online. A lot of homegrown tools people have built. Now the networks are becoming really high performance, and you're dropping down a lot of network devices with pretty rich IP connectivity. And you want to start applying a lot of those same principles to the networking that you used to apply to the servers. You want to make it really easy to build out a networking device. You want to make the configurations as kind of cookie cutter as possible, with minor variations based on where you live in the network, as opposed to making them handcrafted. Okay. And so that's what you see. You see a very kind of computer science or systems engineering oriented way of looking at network deployments.
Okay. And will Cumulus Linux become, one of the big complaints that people always had around various, I'll just use iOS or NXOS as an example, was if I ever had a bug in one piece of code, a BGP bug, an OSPF bug, it could be as simple as a telnet bug, I had to wait for an entire new build of OS to come along. Obviously, Linux knows how to do packages and patch management. Do you guys inherit all the same kind of goodness qualities that you typically get with Linux, or does that change somewhat?
No, we inherit all of that. So we're using, like I said, we're based off of Debian, so we get to use the apt repository management tool set. So it allows customers to upgrade one package at a time. They can leave all their old packages intact if they'd like to. It's a very flexible way of acquiring the latest or an older version of a package if you'd like. Okay. And I would assume, since you're dealing with stuff at larger scale, the types of skills needed to operate this, I mean, is this something you're seeing people deploy in kind of CLOS or leaf and spine deployments where that we've got combined control and data plane, or are you seeing this primarily where people are doing more controller based, a Nicira type of controller driven, or a big switch? Have you seen anything come out of it, or is it still lots of different deployment models for customers? In general, it's a lot of different deployment models. We have one customer who's runs a CDN, and they have one switch per pop, but it just so happens that they get to, it's really easy for them to deploy, and they're running some of their homegrown software on top of it, and so the whole system is very straightforward for them to put together. Okay. We have other customers that are running massive CLOS-based networks, or actually multi-tier CLOS networks that are using a homegrown overlay technology, kind of akin to Nicira, but it's not Nicira. Okay. Then we have another customer that uses a Nicira as a network virtualization overlay. So it's a lot of different topologies, but inevitably what people are looking for is high capacity networking that's easy to deploy and affordable.
Okay, and I assume all the details of this will come out once you guys launch, but without you guys being bound to the hardware, you've got a number of manufacturers that are building it. I assume you're then not going to be sort of bound to a certain segment of the network. I mean, you guys could be deployed data center core. In theory, you could be deployed WAN edge. I mean, are you seeing the hardware guys build boxes with enough flexibility interfaces to kind of go anywhere? Or are there certain sweet spots right now?
I think the sweet spot right now is still in the data center. I'll call it data center edge, and it's going to be moving to data center core next. But I think you're onto something that as this model starts to pick up, there's a lot of opportunity again to separate the available hardware and embed functionally appropriate software into it. So this model can transition to that WAN edge of a data center. It can transition into campus. You're hearing it discussed as sometimes as network function virtualization for some of the big service providers, where they're deciding that they just want to run an x86 server and put some piece of software that used to be in a Cavium or some sort of a network processor based platform and just run it there.
Okay, so it won't be entirely bound to what you would consider a network platform. This could also run on traditional x86 platforms, which they're becoming almost the same thing.
Right.
Okay. So yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to let you go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to just sort of last question because obviously you guys are swamped trying to get stuff ready for the launch. So for people that are curious about this, beyond going to the new website, where will they be able to sort of engage with you guys in terms of hackathons, getting access to some code and starting to play with it, or where can people expect to see you guys out in the communities and so forth, or out in the marketplace?
Well, obviously we'll beat the trails to some of the bigger, more typical conferences. We'll be at Structure, we're going to be VM Worlds, the Ops Code events. Mm-hmm. We're going to hit a lot of the DevOps community so that they're aware of the technology and how it can help them out. And from the website, we're taking customers. If you come by and talk to somebody, make sure that we're able to meet your needs. We're happy to deliver software and connect you up with a hardware partner as soon as we launch.
Okay. Well, very, very cool. Well, JR, again, thank you today for the time, but more importantly, thank you for being patient with us and giving us a second chance. Folks, a lot of very interesting stuff there. As you all know, just massive paradigm change happening nowadays in networking, sort of paralleling what we've seen in the servers. So for JR, I want to say thank you very much. For Aaron, who will be on the next show. Folks, you can always get everything off of thecloudcast.net or follow us at thecloudcast.net on Twitter. So for JR, for the folks at Cumulus, thank you very much for the time today, and everybody have a great week.